This is Emergency FD Storyline.
We lose about 100 firefighters every year. It might be 90 this year and 110 next year. But as one of my favorite fire chiefs said, America throws firefighters at the fire. And we lose about 100 every year. And we got better clothes, better protection. We're still losing 100 firefighters.
It takes a special individual to be a firefighter. The firefighter is a real modern-day hero in a world where heroes are hard to find. To be a firefighter, even for a short time, is a privilege. To know a firefighter is a privilege as well that leaves a lasting impact. That's one of the reasons for this podcast. The views expressed on this program are from the guest and the host and do not necessarily represent the views of any government agency, private company, or public service. Emergency FD Storyline's focus is to tell the stories of those in the fire service and to highlight what matters to our first responders. I'm your host, Tom Mann. As a kid, I wanted to be a firefighter. I think most people want to be firefighters, but only the few have the chance, and only the few can be firefighters. When I was a kid, there was the firefighter that lived in my neighborhood. He was that hero that I admired. He was a big man, strong man, a passionate man of conviction, a man of service. He was a firefighter and one of the first paramedics. And for years, he served as a pastor and chaplain. Service was his calling, and he was instrumental in what I'm doing right now. His name is Rhesa Davis, the firefighter next door. That's our storyline.
We're sitting on the porch here in Tennessee with somebody who had a big influence on my life because he was the firefighter I knew as a kid. He was the paramedic I knew as a kid, and then as I got a little bit older and I wanted to ride with the Memphis Fire Department and capture him on video, I knew one name, and that name was Rhesa Davis. And at the same time, I was producing a radio program for Rhesa. He was the chaplain of the local 1784, and we would put that on the air. And so I asked Rhesa, how can I get on a fire engine, fire truck? I don't even think I knew the difference back in that day. And how can I do that? And he said, well, you need to talk to the director. He said, but maybe you should talk to the union president. So that was Sam Posey. And then I met Sam, and then thus I went to see, I think it was Charlie Smith at the time, and next thing you know, I'm taping for 10 years the City of Memphis Fire Department. And at the time, I remember that, Rhesa, you were on Squirt 1, Engine 54.
Yeah.
And I can remember me having a couple meals out there at that station, which was, I think, the Firehouse Surprise. And I think the discussion was that people would pick up animals on the road and eat that stuff. I don't know if that was true or not.
No.
No. Anyway, but Rhesa, I'm glad you're here. So that's glad to talk to you. When you came on, describe the job and where you started and what it was like at that moment. I'm going to even ask you things about equipment and what was the job like when you started, and when was that?
In 1967, things were very strict. We had lineup every morning at 6:55 in full dress uniform. After 5 minutes, you were dismissed, and you either took your position on the equipment or you went home. You know, you changed shifts. And the idea was that you could exchange information, and the oncoming shift could pick up on what they had missed the previous day. But it was a 72-hour week. So you worked every other day, and every 2 weeks you had a Kelly Day. And a Kelly Day made it so you had 3 days off. We had somebody on watch 24 hours, and we actually had deputy chiefs. They might be in front of your engine house at 3 o'clock in the morning to see if you walked outside.
Wow.
We were supposed to check outside every 15 minutes. And we had one particular chief that he might be sitting down the street to see if you opened the door and looked up and down the street. But somebody had to be awake. And at the station I worked at, we had over 20 personnel. We had 2 pumpers a salvage corps, and a tower that had been in service since the 1890s.
Was this in Dallas?
Oh, this was
in Memphis. You started in Memphis.
Started in Memphis in 67.
So you're talking about the water tower.
Yeah, and I actually saw the water tower in service. You could get more water through that water tower than anything else on the job, but you couldn't move it. When you started pumping water through there, it was fixed. It was an antique, but it worked. I mean, if you could park it in front of a burning building like a lumber yard or something, it's great. Somebody had to be on watch, and it was just like the military: night watch, middle watch, and last watch. And the thing about last watch was the coffee. You had to have enough coffee for everybody. Back in the 60s, guys came in early. We got up at 0600, and everybody would sit around the kitchen table drinking coffee and, as we call it, swapping lies. But it was a fellowship. That's the way it was in the 60s.
Did you come in when they were wearing the all-service, the filter masks on the back of your coat?
Yes.
And then you had the steel helmet.
Yeah.
The senator helmet.
Yeah, I bought mine. I've got it.
What was that like with the gear you had? Describe that for me.
The filter mask stayed in a sewed-up pouch on your back, and you were supposed to keep it sealed. And then if you needed to use it, you'd take the tape off, unseal it, and you suck the atmosphere of wherever you were, in the house or the warehouse, and you suck that atmosphere through those layers of filter. It was a physical deal. They were hard to use, and a lot of the guys wouldn't use them. I learned to use it. You just had to overcome that fear and the idea that you're having to pull air through those filters. Supposedly you were getting good air. The truck people had air masks. We didn't. Pumper people did not have air tanks. The truck companies did have air tanks because they were supposed to be ready for rescue, but they were closed up in a box up on top of the aerial. It was a chore just to get to them. A lot of the guys in the 60s, the motto was that if you can't take the smoke, go get you a job. And a lot of the guys didn't wear any kind of a mask.
Leather lungs, the smoke eaters, and that was a reality. So when you came on being new, that was what that was like. And you also mentioned to me before we started this, you were saying that when you came on, you were listening to the guys that came before you. And you were describing those guys.
Yeah.
We're talking about men who were there during the 30s you were talking about. So what was that like in the mentorship they gave you?
They were tough. They had a mental attitude of going into burning buildings, especially downtown, where you had no way to get fresh air, and you just did what you had to do. And it took a lot of firemen to the hospital in some of those fires. Those guys were tough. I admired them.
Did you guys still ride on the back of the pumpers?
We stood on the tailboard and hung on for dear life.
That's literally.
And you learned where the dips were and the railroad tracks were. It would throw you off if you weren't prepared, if you weren't thinking. But riding the tailboard and holding on to whatever you could hold on to, there was an aluminum bar that stretched across the hose bed. You learned how to get into your boots, and an old captain showed me how to do this, because the driver, he'll leave you. They would leave you. So you better have a method where you grab with your right hand, grab your helmet and put it on, and run your left hand through the left arm of your coat. Swing it around so that your right arm could go through the right side of your coat. At the same time, you're toeing your boots to get your feet in your boots. We got two rounds on the vocal. They'd give you the address twice. And you better be ready to go on that second round, because the driver was going.
Regardless.
Well, they tried to leave you. They tried to leave you. They were out of there quickly. I don't think it's like that anymore.
This is a total different world.
Yep.
The Firefighter Next Door. We'll continue with my interview with retired Memphis firefighter Rhesa Davis in just a moment. I want to remind you can help with the production of this podcast by going to our website at EmergencyFD.com or EmergencyFDStoryline.com. Look for the tab at the top of the page that says More. Click on that. Then you'll see another tab that says Donate. Click on that. And you can give a gift of any amount that will make a difference. Thank you so much. Got a question. Do you remember the television series Emergency? You know, Squad 51? As a kid growing up in the 70s, my guest was a real paramedic, like the ones on television. So let's continue that story and memories that he has, and a unique perspective on being a firefighter. So join me again on the back porch at his home in Tennessee. You might even hear some rain in the background in part of the interview as I continue my conversation with my guest, Rhesa Davis, the firefighter next door.
You had the advantage, and you were one of the first as the paramedic programs came on and getting involved with being a paramedic. That was a total new adventure. Tell me about that, how that took place and where it took you. How did that happen? I remember the television show called Emergency.
Yeah.
So tell me how that all took place.
I took my turn on the units. This is something you might find interesting. The units were station wagons, Oldsmobile and Cadillac station wagons. And we had 3 firefighters on a unit. And that was before anybody was an EMT or a paramedic. When the unit pulled out of the engine house, we had our white shirt and tie on with our uniform cap. And then they gave us a break where you didn't have to wear your tie or your uniform cap. Let's back up a little bit to 1959. I was on my Harley Davidson and I followed the Raleigh Volunteer Pumper. There was a grass fire and they put this 5 gallons of water on my back with a hand pump, and I helped put the fire out. I loved it. And then in '65, going to the University of Memphis, I took a first aid course. And nobody on the fire department was doing that. It was just up to anybody that was going to school. In '67, I got on the Memphis Fire Department. I still don't know if anybody was doing first aid, or that's all we called it, was first aid. There was talk of a paramedic program, but it was just talk. Doctors didn't want it. Nurses didn't want it. I can remember when I got my paramedic years later, we'd make a call, and if a doctor was on the scene, he was defensive. Take him to the hospital, boys, where there's a real doctor. They felt that way about guys that fight fire and pull ceilings are going to stick needles in people? You got to be joking. So when I moved to Texas, I got on Dallas Fire Department. That was in '71, and they were involved in the program. I was in their second paramedic class. We had great instructors.
So again, you went from Memphis to Dallas Fire, and then that was '71.
I got a bachelor's degree from University of Memphis, and then I went for my master's degree at Southwestern Seminary in Fort Worth, and I was on the Dallas Fire Department. Dallas, you worked a day and was off too. That was quite a change from working every other day from Memphis. And eventually Memphis went to a different shift. Anyway, we did all our training at Parkland Hospital.
Everybody knows Parkland from John F. Kennedy being brought
Oh, they were talking about Kennedy. Everybody, this was in '71, everybody was talking about it. The police chief had a booklet. He had actually composed about a 15-page book and stuff that you never read or heard of anywhere else. There were just a lot of strange things that happened in Dallas that day. There were people behind the school book depository that were never really questioned.
You got to hear all this from the people that were there then.
The Lincoln limousine that transported Kennedy and he was taken to Parkland emergency room was cleaned up by some of the detectives just trying to do a good thing. They came out there with sponges and cloths and soapy water and cleaned up the crime scene, not realizing what they were doing was a crime scene. So we lost a lot of information there.
But that's where you were doing your time then.
Yeah. Dallas and Memphis had the same mentality about firefighting. Get inside, hit the fire, knock it down. There were no outside firefighters at either city. Dallas had small air tanks, last you 5 or 10 minutes, which was enough to get in and knock the fire down. Yeah, you worked at Parkland Hospital, and And some of the guys got jobs after they got through their schooling, got to be paramedics. Baylor University had an IV team. They were firemen. And so when somebody wanted an IV, one of the firefighters that was certified IV paramedic would go to the room and start an IV on the patient.
So how long was that when you went through the program? How long was that? And then you wound up back in Memphis.
Well, I was in Dallas for 6 years, and the Memphis fire chief told me that if I wanted to come back to Memphis, I had an opening, and I did. I hired back on Memphis in '77.
You hired on as a paramedic or as a firefighter, or both?
Nashville did not accept the Dallas paramedic program.
So you were back on fire then?
Mm-hmm. I challenged the basic EMT test and passed it, so they accepted the EMT, but I had to go back through paramedic.
Also during that time, we get close to that 78 period, that's when there was a full strike.
Yes.
And so how was that when you come back to the city and all of a sudden this is involved? That was a big deal back then.
The mayor and the union negotiated, and the union said, this is what we're standing for, or we're walking out. And the mayor, frankly, would tell the public and the news media one thing and tell us another thing. And we walked. We had picket lines all over the city. We had rescue squads ready for life saving and make intervention on any fire calls. There were a lot of buildings that were set on fire. In my opinion, they wanted to blame it on the union. No, I think it was people that they saw a golden opportunity to collect some insurance. That's my opinion.
And I guess that was a big year, and I know that had to be a big year as far as
78.
Yeah, and that's just a big historical time. I can remember that myself.
A lot of things went on during that strike. That we had military personnel with their M1 Grands at all the stations. They didn't give us any trouble. I was at the corner of Watkins and Cleveland, a 28th fire station. So we had a picket line 24/7. They got the strike settled and we went back to work.
What had changed technology-wise from 67 to 77? What had happened or what had taken place between those years?
Oh, little things like the way we loaded the hose. Not so much reliance on the booster. We went to 1.5 inches, which turned out to be 1.75 inches. It's amazing how much more firefighting you can do with 1.75 inches than 1.5 inches. In the 60s, we wore white starched shirts, and you always had clean shirts in your locker. And my routine was, as soon as the alarm went off, take that white shirt off. You were down to a T-shirt. In the 70s, we had T-shirts that were designed to say Memphis Firefighter. We eventually went from the hip boots, which I'm 6'2", and my hip boots only came up above my knees.
Made it a little warm, didn't it?
Oh, golly. But we went to full turnouts on every run. You stepped into your pants and pulled them up. We had a man came off a tailboard and was killed, so they stopped us from riding the tailboard.
And that happened in the 70s or later
Yes.
70s? Okay.
Yes. I think around 71, 72. Now everybody's supposed to be in a cab and seated, and everybody wears full turnouts. We're supposed to.
Even up to, I guess, 92, there were guys still wearing hip boots even then, and the vast majority had started wearing the pants and other things, but there were a lot of guys out there still just wearing hip boots. They didn't want to wear anything else. I can remember that.
Well, they were hot. And then they came out with this, we were all excited when they said, oh, we're getting new turnouts, and it's going to be breathable material. They didn't. They were just as hot as anything else we ever had.
When did it change over where you had to be wearing an SCBA? And I know that still was a long time till people really did it.
I remember in 77, I was riding 28s. We made an apartment fire where some of the guys had their SCBA on and some didn't. So it was optional in 77. Now, how much longer it was optional, I don't know. That was the fire where I cut my ulnar nerve in my right wrist.
How did that happen?
Well, the guys were yelling for air. They didn't have air packs on. So I was raising windows and knocking out windows and what we call truck work, ventilation. And a piece of glass missed my glove and my turnout coat and cut my ulnar nerve. That's the nerve that goes to your funny bone. And I spent a week in the hospital. I was on the operating table 4 hours. The doctor sewed my nerve back together under magnification. You can't even see that nerve. And he's so proud of himself. After that, every time he saw me, he would grab me and start introducing me to friends of his. Look what I did. I sewed this guy's ulnar nerve back together. Great guy. That was in 77, so I knew it was optional then to wear an air pack.
Then what do you remember about I guess we get out of the 70s and you told me the riot helmets?
I like that motorcycle helmet. It's more like a European helmet.
Yeah.
And it came down over your ears and the back of your neck, and people complained about it being heavy. So I don't like what they're wearing now where it sits up on the top of your head. I want something to come down over around my ears. And
'Cause I've heard that both ways. When you hear that, that's always what somebody thinks. But I heard a chief the other day talk about that, if I had gotten one of those new European helmets, and he said, I can't stand those things and how they look. He said, you're supposed to get your ears burned. And he was joking about that. He said, one day it's all going to be that way.
Back in the 60s, I glued a piece of felt over my ears because if that metal helmet that we wore got hot enough, it'd burn your ears. And that was kind of something that we went by. If my ears were burning, I knew I need to get out of here. It's too hot. But what most of us did on those old metal helmets, we turned them around backwards. And the shield from the old metal helmet gave you a shield that you could actually shielded your face. You can't do that with any of these new helmets. Can't do it. But we would turn that old helmet with that long dipping shield around, and we put just a little piece of felt above our ears to keep our ears from getting burnt.
And you move forward 70s, you get into the 80s. Is that when a lot of things came into place? I've talked to a bunch of people that you get in the 80s and 90s and you really get into methods of firefighting and technology started changing. And somebody was talking about yesterday, telling me about how reports and details and learning from incidences, and did that kind of start taking place, or what was it that changed? Or did it change?
The Germans have a way of firefighting that we don't. You know, the old school is that you take a fog pattern and go into a burning house. Every little bit of fog absorbs 1,700 times its size of heat. And so with those little droplets of fog, you put the fire out. Yeah, it's different. A lot of things are coming down that I'm not familiar with, really. We have school out here. You're not so quick to rush into a building. Through a front door or through a window, you get down on the ground and put a straight stream through the window into the ceiling. And it is supposed to envelop the fire and extinguish it, or at least get it to the point to where you can go in and knock down what's left. And I've never had the opportunity to do that, but I hear them talk about it when we have school. And we got chiefs out here that believe that and do it.
You wound up later, you retired, you were on Squirt 1, right?
Yeah, that was a brand new piece of equipment that nobody knew how to operate unless you went out there and were trained on it. I loved it because of its uniqueness.
I remember you putting out an apartment over there in Walnut Grove and Germantown Road.
Yep.
Almost single-handedly, you got that squirt up there and you put that whole thing already out.
The battalion chief that was riding out of 21s coming down Walnut Grove was looking at the bloom of fire and calling for extra pumpers. And then he looked up and it was gone. We raised that squirt and 54s went to a hydrant. So there's our source of water. I knew my equipment. I knew how to work the nozzle. I knew how to work the aerial. The whole top floor was fully involved. It was burning through the roof, through the walls. By the time the guys had their air packs on to go in, I had it knocked down. All we had to do was overhaul.
Tell us, Squirt. I remember that.
Yeah, which they got rid of.
From when you retired, what did you do?
Well, I helped start the Hickoryworth Volunteer Fire Department. Guys from Memphis have retired and come out here to be chiefs and keep things going and organized. Fayette County's got a good volunteer fire department.
Some of the toughest situations that you found yourself in and that still stick with you, fires, people, or incidences.
I'm trying to remember what year it was. This lady had been thrown through the rear window of her car, and she was out laying in the street there on Elvis Presley in front of Elvis's home. And on the way to the emergency room, she was talking to me, and she didn't make it. Her lungs were filled with blood. In my effort, by intubating her in what we call the BVM, the bag valve mask, I couldn't get any air in her. Her lungs were full of blood. She definitely needed decompression to get the blood out of her lungs. I was not taught that. Yeah, there's some things like that you replay. What could I have done? Now, all paramedics do chest decompression. But there's just some things that you don't forget. Drunk drivers running over people, running into cars, and they don't remember what they did. The night out on Broad Avenue when I was riding Truck 8, the wreck was so violent that the engine was sitting by itself in the middle of Broad Avenue. One front fender was in the street, another front fender was back up the road. I forget how many people died in that wreck. But they clipped one of those big utility poles, tore the car apart, and killed 2 or 3 people that were in the car.
Any others that you remember, death of firefighters, line of duty deaths, and what do you remember about them all?
Well, I worked with Martin. He would try to help me with my Spanish. He was on the fire squad, and when the inside of the building became untenable, he got lost, and he burned up. He literally was burned up. The building was divided, so to get out of there, you had to go down this hallway. And Martin didn't go down the hallway. He went to the right of the hallway. I think he had 5 kids. That was my first line of duty death that I spoke in the church as fire department chaplain. Later, he had a son who was also a firefighter that was shot and killed.
And then the other ones, I know you were involved with the Hill, Boswell, Mathis and Bridges. Rutledge? No, too.
I spoke at Rutledge's funeral. They turned the ladder truck over. That was in Raleigh.
One thing, you had the perspective of being the chaplain at the time. Tell me a little bit about that, because I know that you get deep involved with that, with the families and everyone else. And
questions. The family always has questions. The church in Fraser, we lost 2 firefighters. The funeral home in South Memphis, I was able to talk to the senator, and he listened to me. The family was upset because they're thinking that he wasn't supposed to be in that house on fire, that church on fire. And I said, Senator, we're going in to fight fire. There would have to be some obstacle to stop us. We're going in. And I said, these men went in to fight fire. So it wasn't like somebody decided these 2 were going in and nobody else. He was very patient in listening to me about my opinion. That was a freak deal. The back of the church was on fire, and it went up into the attic and just went down over the auditorium. And for some strange reason, there were 3 firefighters inside, and the ceiling gave way and it just covered them with fire. They were wearing hip boots. It burned them up. I went up to the hospital for several days, and they sedated the men, hopefully that they could get them to a point where they could bring them out of their induced coma, but they didn't make it. But again, the questions of why were they in there? And I got a chance to tell the senator, I said, that's what we do. We lose about 100 firefighters every year. It might be 90 this year and 110 next year. But as one of my favorite fire chiefs said, America throws firefighters at the fire, and we lose about 100 every year. And we got better clothes, better protection. We're still losing 100 firefighters.
Your faith that you have, which has been your life, how has that made a difference in dealing with the memories, the wish I could have's, I should have, or it turned out this way, and you can't, I mean, this is ongoing. You can't get that out of your head. The people that are lost, the tragedies. How does that help you deal with that without coming undone, if that's the better word for that?
I lost my best friend when we were 11. That was my first encounter with death. And you can't expect to lose your mother and daddy, which I have. I've been a believer in Jesus Christ ever since I was a kid. I believe that Jesus rose from the dead. I believe he has rule over our lives and our deaths, that when we die, we get to go be with Jesus. And that's a pretty good deal. It'll make up for all the heartache and all the hurting we've had down here. But I guess I accept it. I've learned to accept death. Not that I like it, but it's part of life. But no, there'll never be answers to some of the questions we have. I'm 78 years old. I can't believe how fast life has gone by. But we have to learn that we're all going to die. It's just a matter of when and to be ready.
What did you like most about being a firefighter?
Believing that you're a plus, that you're a comfort to people that are hurting, to see the look of relief on their face when you walk up. They might express, thank God you're here. And I guess it's the satisfaction of doing something that other people can't do, won't do, don't know how to do. Yeah, it's very satisfying. And one of the things that I've learned, because I've lived up in the country, and when a house burns down, you don't find the bodies. One man in Middleton, Tennessee, was walking up and down through the ashes. His wife and kids, we couldn't even find anything, no bones or anything. I'll never forget him saying, I can't even have a funeral. I don't have anything to bear. And was told at work to go home. And when he got up here to Middleton, there's nothing but ashes. So, as a firefighter, even though you pull a body out of a burning house, you have saved that family's loved one from being burned to ashes. And they can have a funeral. It's a great job. Be prepared. Just be prepared. And enjoy it while you can, because life is short.
Well, Rhesa Davis, thank you for sharing with me and talking about the many different things.
The Firefighter Next Door. My guest, retired firefighter Rhesa Davis. I want to thank my friend Bill Adelman for the use of his photos of Rhesa Davis, all part of the Adelman's History of the Memphis Fire Department. You can find it on Facebook. And I want to remind you there are many ways to listen to the EmergencyFD Storyline podcasts, like on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, Deezer, Podchaser, Podcast Addict, iHeartRadio, Amazon Music, TuneIn Alexa, Pandora, Buzzsprout, and more. And you can find this podcast on our website at emergencyfd.com or at emergencyfdstoryline.com. And be sure to subscribe and follow, no matter where you listen, to get the latest podcasts as they're released. And as always, if you would like to contact Emergency FD Storyline with comments or to suggest a story or a subject for an upcoming podcast, email us at storyline@emergencyfd.com. That's storyline@emergencyfd.com. Find us on Facebook. Look for Emergency FD. I'm Tom Mann, and I want to thank you for listening. There are many stories coming on Emergency FD Storyline. Join us.